Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for inviting me to chair this meeting. I think it's a big task for me, but anyway, I try to do my best and then to capture your opinion, but also your discussion that you're going to contribute in this discussion. I have been informed that there is a couple of questions I have to set on the table before we start the discussion. But before we start,
we have some videos that were taken at the Soil Organic Matter conference. I think probably quite a lot of you were there already. So some of the people were unable to attend today. So they very kindly gave some sound bites for us to get the debate going about certain questions. So we've got just two very short videos, and there's a couple of questions that I'd like Abad to ask the panel then from that.
We have a large areas of arable land which are quite depleted in carbon, so we've got quite a significant potential there to gain carbon in those soils.
Okay.
UK soils are very resilient, but there's plenty of opportunity to increase the organic matter content, especially in some of the old arable soils.
So this is amazing. We've got agreement from two soil scientists on the same issue.
Yeah, so just before we go into this question that's been addressed by the videos, I have one question, and it is completely related from what we're going to have. Is when it was in the beginning of the session, it was asked who is believing in UK that we can increase 4permil soil carbon, and it was majority. Basically, they said not achievable. So in your opinion, why it is not achievable? Why? Why do you think it is not achievable? Because it is due to the business as usual, because it's scientifically it is not proven, because it is we cannot do it, or because there is other forces, political forces that avoid us to make this thing happen, at least in the UK. So why do you think it is not achievable?
I normally don't use yeah, but I think David said this, that the proportion of soils where we can intervene in management is relatively small. And there are large areas where, and again, we saw in Wales, large areas where it's very difficult to intervene in management. Well, at least the way we manage at the moment. So I think it is the fact that we've got a relatively small potential to intervene if we follow our normal practice of management. If we don't manage, I've forgotten, natural habitats, I think it was, yes, habitat sites. Now, in the past, there's been no encouragement to manage habitat sites. In fact, there has been discouragement. It might be that we need to think more positively about managing those habitat sites.
Okay. Any other comment?
Thank you very much for all the speakers. I think I've got perhaps two answers to that. The first of which is more of a terminology which was picked up in Claire's talk at the beginning about what we mean by 4permil, the actual figure. And I think that generally tends to be emphasised, the figure, the quantitative 0.4%, as opposed to that more nominal increase or maintenance of soil. So I think at the time that we asked the question at the start of the meeting, we hadn't obviously heard your talk, and I'd be very interested to see whether that changed the result for the poll. But the second thing, and kind of reflecting on my own work on soil erosion, I don't think it's possible at the moment to increase or maintain carbon stock in soils because we're losing soil. We're thinning soils in many areas of this particular country and across the world. So I think that was the second point I wanted to make as to why I don't think it's achievable, at the moment at least.
Okay, if we go back to the videos then, so we're talking about arable soils in particular, so there's 2 points were made, and also this was brought up in some of the presentations. So Bridget showed some data from monitoring schemes. You know, both monitoring schemes actually agreed, the only thing they agreed on was that actually there was loss in carbon from arable sites. So, you know, is there potential there? So we identify this as a hotspot. So, you know, are hammered arable soils actually able then to sequester carbon? So that's the sort of question for the panel. Starting with Bridget.
I'll just. I mean, I thought David gave lots of evidence that hammered arable soils we clearly can, but we need to take the hit on food production. And so it's about choices we've got to make, not just on arable, but also in our habitat land. trees might help us grow carbon, but then we've got to do a trade-off with, half sheep per hectare isn't really about food security. It's about, and I think one of the constraints is about life, the rights of people, in cultural land and what have you. So all of this is about choices we have to make. Anything is possible. I mean, the hammered arable soils, to me, yes, we probably can if we just stop tilling them every year, and, we can probably increase carbon, but are we willing to take the food hit on that? And if not, how, so where else, if we're just going to import food from somewhere else, it's the classic pollution swapping, and ethically that's really questionable.
With an arable soil that's low in carbon, I think some of the things you can do will be zero tillage. As again has been said, that actually the main thing that does is concentrate carbon near the surface, which is a good thing anyway, but over the long term there is a small total accumulation. Where soil would otherwise be bare, perhaps when you're growing a spring-sown crop, you could grow a cover crop, because that's good for mopping up nitrate and also put some extra organic matter into the soil. In some cases that seems to work well, but in some farming situations there are complications, so it's not a panacea. I think where you've got, in some cases you could do intercropping. I don't know how relevant this is here, but certainly in parts of Africa you can grow legumes between the rows of maize, where you've got a lot of space, so that could be done here as well. Agroforestry, I think, has got some possibilities, and perhaps changes of and also, moving towards a more mixed farming system where you've got a rotation, I think would be valuable. I'm told there are practical and economic barriers to that, but as I said, through changes of subsidies you could force that direction if you really wanted to. And also I gather that some farmers are now doing a sort of virtual mixed farming by a sheep farmer bringing some of his sheep to an arable farmer's land, and the arable farmer grows grass for a year or two without becoming an animal farmer.
Yeah, I think there are different ways to increase soil organic matter content in soils, and again I would like to insist on that. In some cases increases the organic matter content, so I'm talking about content, not stocks, in the very surface is per se an advantage, at least in terms of erosion, reducing the risk of erosion. So even though no tillage in our conditions generally does not have an effect on total organic carbon stocks, it is beneficial in terms of reducing erosion risk. It is beneficial in terms of soil biodiversity, soil life in general. So for me, personally, in the 4permil initiative, again, the motto is increasing soil organic matter content for food security first. Climate change mitigation, climate change attenuation. And for me, personally, the climate change mitigation is a co-benefit. And it's extremely stimulating because it really puts this question of managing soil carbon in this wide perspective. Food production, climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, and preservation of natural resources and ecosystem services. Water quality should not be forgotten. And now we're trying in the scientific committee to put this forward.
Thank you, Claire. So I think just to summarize, I think it was also mentioned by the speaker, David and Claire and other speakers, that we have the technology to do better and to overcome. So I think we agree, all of us, about it. And I think that's something that Bridget mentioned, that the problem that comes up now I think the major problem, at least in UK, that from far I understood, that it's just the problem come from arable land losing carbon, not in natural land. And I think that's what you mentioned?
Arable was up until 2007, but now the last 10 years is now the more natural land is losing carbon as well. So,
and I do believe that, I think that it is a good signal that at least in natural system that you have a stability or increase in carbon, because some of the reduction of these emission and reduction of the increase of the pH and all of these things. But
it's the other way around. Sorry, are we talking? So the habitat land is now losing carbon.
But arable crop, you are mentioning that you're losing more carbon in the last 10 years.
No, that was habitat land. So that's
okay.
conservation land. So the areas where we have hoped and actually put a lot of our agri-environment payments is now losing soil carbon for reasons are unclear. So my argument was that arable we know has been in trouble, and now we've got our habitat land is now losing carbon as well. So both are actually losing. So we've got to find solutions. And the peatlands, we also know, the East Anglia peat. So actually, it's pretty much for different reasons. In the peats, it's kind of shrinking. We're losing it literally in depth. In other, so it's quite a few of our systems now about that I think we've got evidence of. So that's the challenge.
Okay, thank you for correcting me. I think that we should have this integrity of the ecosystem. I mean, we should have, if we are focusing only on arable land and then putting the effort to increase the carbon, but we should not forget also natural land, because we have to think about the integrity of the ecosystem and not compartmenting the system as such. So we have this added value on both systems, and this is for me a way to increase the carbon totally. Because if we are increasing or we are putting effort in arable land, so we need the natural system because the biodiversity comes from there. And without this natural system, we are not going to work only on arable land. Even we do believe that we need for production for food security and everything. So integrity of the ecosystem as such is, I think that's something that we need to push out for it.
Okay, shall we hear from Keith again?
Yes, Keith had quite a lot to say, apparently.
Yeah.
So talking about other land uses.
UK soils are very resilient. It's going to be difficult to do it on the ground. It's going to be difficult to do it on the grassland soils and under forestry.
Yeah,
of course.
Yeah,
we agree.
But the question is, this is also a managed system, so we manage our grasslands and our forestry. So there obviously is a big focus, as we were talking about before, on the arable land. So what is the potential then for doing this potential on these other land use types that we do actually manage?
Dick Thompson again. I would like to suggest that we become a bit more sophisticated in terms of how we talk about soil. I'm quite happy to talk about grasslands and woodlands and arable land, but beneath those land use systems, there are a whole range of different soils. Bridget very kindly showed the soilscapes map. There are 29 broad classes of soil on there, which represent, 300 soil associations. But in terms of the habitat land and the question I asked, I was sort of expecting to get the answer that these were brown podzolics or stagnant podzols or peaty clays or whatever. And what I would like to propose is that we start to think about strategies for sequestering carbon on each of those soil types, because they are very different systems and will respond differently to the same management stimulus. And so your results from the Welsh uplands does surprise me, and it would be interesting to try to get to the bottom of what is happening there, because when you first got up, I was thinking that there were opportunities with the cessation of lime subsidies on the brown pods, the broad freeland within Wales, that carbon might increase there because it was going to, they would eventually become more acid and therefore respiration rates would drop. Thinking broadly, you can either acidify soils and cause carbon sequestration, or you can re-wet them and cause a drop in respiration rate again and get carbon sequestration. And there are large areas of Wales and Scotland and probably upland England where there are inherently wet soils which have been artificially drained, which I think have real potential for carbon sequestration if you paid farmers for the loss of production.
So I think this whole idea of farming carbon in the uplands is a really interesting one, and it's how do we do it? And if you like, this is the whole thing of pollution swapping. So we've reduced acid rain, which is terrific, and that might be it's like the DOC in our water trend. An impact of that might be because we're losing soil carbon now, but it was only that we gained a bit because we were polluting it with acidity before. But I think thinking forward how we, some of the places where we're currently farming I think going forward post-cap is really going to have to be looked at quite carefully. And that's really challenging for a lot of people, but you can spot from space how deforested we are as a country. And we have drained land that it might be that we want to just, I mean, a lot of the tile drains are anyway bust, so they're anyway not doing as much. So they're neither producing very good food, nor are they actually slowing decomposition in the way Joe's doing. And perhaps we just need to make a decision, instead of just having rather badly drained land that doesn't really grow many animals or support many animals. Perhaps we just need to make a decision. You know what? Let's just re-wet them or grow trees on them, or decide to really put lime and fertilizer on and get the plants growing, capturing carbon for us as well. But this kind of in-between where we're not doing either very well seems to me a bit of a lost opportunity at the moment that we might want to revisit.
Can I just add to that? I think back to this grazing issue. We have a lot of animals in this country, and we're leaving the EU, and all those opportunities change. And actually, we don't, when we think about soil carbon, we know a lot about manure amendment rates and crop, in agricultural systems, but in these grassland systems and these semi-natural systems, we actually don't know very much about the rate of litter inputs, and also the impact that grazing has on limiting those inputs. So with those sort of peaty pod soils and glaze soils, a lot of them are used for grazing. And if we actually remove the sheep or reduce the stocking densities of the sheep in those areas, there is, I would say on paper, potential to actually increase the carbon sequestration rates in those simply by increasing the litter production rate, because we know that these soils grow. So, and it's such an obvious thing, to be fair. It's not rocket science, but actually I think there's quite a lot of opportunity there, personally.
Can I make a comment? I mean, that may well be true, but presumably there'd be a social issue there. If you're removing sheep from upland areas, there will be people who will lose their livelihood, or they're going to be paid not to do it, and the landscape will be different, which will affect tourism and stuff, I guess. Is that right?
Well, the landscape will be different. If you remember the last slide I showed, the ungrazed area is a very biodiverse, rich, I would argue aesthetically quite pleasing image. And if we think back about the payments for public goods, and if we're not paying for the sheep, maybe we're paying farming for carbon. It's certainly an idea that's been knocking around the peatland community for the last 10 or so years, supported by the IUCN. There's a peatland carbon code they've set up as a kind of voluntary code of practice people can actually subscribe to if they want to go down the peatland restoration for carbon benefits route, and it could be extended to more organic soils, I think, personally.
David?
Thank you. But David Hopkins. David Polson just mentioned livelihoods, and I think we've got to focus on a particular difficulty that is presented to us if we start telling people what to do. So this is scientists talking about science, and land is managed by farmers who do farming. I think my figures are right. We have in England 3 million hectares of tenanted land. It's something like 40,000 individual holdings, and the average length of a farm business tenancy is just over 3 years. Under those circumstances, there's very little incentive for an individual tenant farmer to put in the time and the investment that's needed in order to increase their soil carbon. So the obstacle, from a farm management point of view, is insufficient tenure on the land to make the long-term investment in managing the land that's needed in order to build soil carbon. We have great examples near where I am in West Oxfordshire, where two adjacent farms, one's tenanted, one's owned. The owner has been working on his land to build his soil carbon for about 15 years. He does all the things that people have spoken about. He keeps it covered. He minimises tillage. He doesn't drive all over the land. He's sympathetic to the earthworms. His soil carbons have increased by 2.5 times. Adjacent farm, next door, he's losing carbon. It's the same soil type. He's running the same business systems, but he's losing carbon. The reason he's losing carbon, he can't afford to put the investment in because he's only got another 2 years left on the tenancy.
Can I just respond to that quickly? So the Crown Estates and the National Trust...
Chris, you should present yourself and then the institution.
So Chris Collins from the University of Reading and coordinator of the NERC Environment Research Council Soil Security Programme. So both the National Trust and the Crown Estate are looking at their tenancy agreements, and they're trying to find processes by which they can ensure that their tenant farmers restore the land during their tenancy and live in a better condition than it was originally given to them, and that will be part of their tenancy agreement. So I think the big landowners are recognising the problem, so hopefully that will expand to other landowners as we go forward.
Maybe I could just add that in France there are discussions with farmers' organizations because they ask for ways to assess the quality of the soil when they are tenants, to be able, yes, to value what they have invested in it. And I think it's important that we as a soil community support the effort to characterize soils. And it's not easy because 3 years, well, we discussed that it's so short, but I think it's needed.
So what about losing the land altogether? So from the government's point of view, how do we implement soil improvement versus housing development and population growth? And so where we're losing arable land that could be improved, so whose responsibility is it to implement 4permil, and can it be a government initiative where there's two really conflicting policies to implement here?
Just to comment I'm just going to be slightly controversial, but if you actually just build on the land, you're locking the carbon up, and it's probably going to be more safe than if you go and till it and grow food on it.
But you're not produce food.
You don't produce food anymore.
You're not getting the 4permil, which is what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
You're locking the carbon, but our aim is to improve it.
No, but I would add you're not producing food, and then you're importing food. What that we do, we're importing food from other countries. So in fact, we have a very strong imprint elsewhere.
Yeah, but how many of you are struggling to buy your first home? We need food, and we need a roof above our head. Yeah. And it goes back to all these issues about social. We have a really big issue in this country with our housing. And it's a big issue where you do houses, and do you put it on prime ag land? Seems a bit daft, but our jobs tend to be linked. And this is not a simple thing. So I go back to David's point of let's just to pull the debate back to where we are. Personally, whilst I love the 4permil initiative with respect to the general idea soil carbon is good, I have stopped using it as a badge just because I get challenged about the numbers about climate change offsetting. And that's just where I am. And it's not because I don't think it's great to focus on soils and carbon, but just to and the urban, and it's all out there, and this is all, discussions about soils in the hull, but just to, just put my thing about the 4permil initiative and how are we all going to use it as a community. At the end of today, I'd really like to know whether we as a community are going to use it or not use it, and how are we going to sell it? Because personally, I'm kind of very uncomfortably on the fence at the moment, saying soil carbon absolutely, but I get really challenged by some of the things on the website about the sheer percentage of offsetting that it can do. So I hear the information here, it's actually about food security. It's not, climate change is secondary. I totally agree with what David's saying. Let's make it a secondary. But if you go onto the website, there are these numbers about 35% offsetting and I just can't defend those numbers. And I don't want to point someone to a website which has got a statistic on it that I can't defend as a scientist. I don't want to be hauled over the coals. And then everything else we're doing on soils, and we're getting massive movement at the moment in government on soils. I don't want you wouldn't believe how one bad statistic can rubbish 100 other ones. We need to be so careful. So just a bit of a rant to just sort of bring us back to 4permil. Thank you.
Can I just respond to Harriet's question there? I think you could think positively in a way. There's quite a lot people could do with their own gardens and home composting. And actually, your gardens are really intensely managed systems, and there is potential for you to actually use your garden. Don't pave it over, add lots of organic matter.
Then there's problems with that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
there are alternatives to peat. Yeah.
You need to educate. Education needs to coincide with gardening.
Yeah. There's people are working on that. I agree with that. But I think in the kind of framing it, you could actually enhance the bit of land that you have responsibility for and use that as best you can.
I would like to answer maybe to Bridget about the internet site. Well, it has changed already. It has changed. If you go, it has changed under pressure from scientists, especially from the Scientific and Technical Committee. There is one graph that we are asking to get rid of. It's the one you showed. It's awful, just awful. Halt. It's not halt. It's contribute to. But we are actively working for that because, of course, it's a nuisance for me.
I mean, but
it has already changed. It's written that it's not a normative objective.
Yeah,
no,
sure. But you did. People did sell the 4permil initiative to policymakers at the climate change conference, which was sort of clever. But I think that slight, which was very well intentioned and good, but it's not quite true. And I think it really has got to be adjusted, as Bridget said.
And just I have to add something, and you can believe how much the politicians are sticking on climate change and greenhouse gas instead of thinking about food security. Recently in Bonn now, the food security become a target in the agenda. It was not, but it's in Europe they are thinking that we have enough food, but we have more problem in greenhouse. So I think it is wrong thinking because we are producing food for Europe, but also we are producing food for other countries.
Yes, Pamela from Birmingham University. It's regarding natural and semi-natural land use types in the UK. So, Tipping published a paper since 1750s or so. By now, the UK natural and semi-natural land use types accumulated 10% more soil organic carbon in response to atmospheric deposition over the years. Of course, that depositions would decrease, but there might be CO2 fertilizations due to increasing atmospheric CO2 concentrations. So maybe Bridget could comment on the land increase already that have happened over the natural and semi-natural land use types that includes forest, peat, and acid grasslands. It already accumulated 10% more carbon according to what Tipping published.
Yes.
Early on. And what you showed on a short time scale from 1998 to 2007, a little dip in the total carbon in woodlands and some of those other systems. So I'm just curious which way to go and how we see it.
Yes. So Ed's
the forecast for decreasing atmospheric nitrogen depositions and increasing CO2 there.
So Ed Tipping's paper, which is great if anyone wants to go and find it, showed that nitrogen, which of course increases productivity, increases carbon. He went to a whole lot of sites, did a really nice mix of monitoring and modelling, and worked out, I think it was 10-15% since the 1780s, I think. In that habitat land that I was showing in Wales, we've lost 1% a year in 10 years. So we've wiped it out in just 10 years. So Ed's paper is terrific for long-term understanding of the links between nitrogen and carbon, what have you. But in this rapid policy assessment that we're talking about now, about changes, I think it was Claire that said it's remarkable how fast you can lose carbon. It's painfully slow to increase sometimes, and it's really easy to lose it quite quickly. So the number I showed for Wales habitat land, that was 1%. We've lost 10% in just 10 years. Goodness, is it climate change? Is it reversal of acidification? Is it something to do with grazing? Is it a change in our hydrological cycle? Research community discuss. But that Ed's paper to me it's really interesting, but adding a whole lot more nitrogen to our systems, which we have spectacularly managed to do. Every bit of land in the UK gets on average 20 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year for free from the atmosphere. I strongly recommend that isn't a very targeted approach to increasing soil carbon. If we want to put nitrogen on somewhere, let's do it in a bag of fertilizer on a bit of land that we know is going to respond and do it. Putting it out into the atmosphere and let it fall over all our nature reserves, our coastal land and our conservation land is a really dumb thing that we managed to do for at least 150 years. Thankfully, we've stabilized it now. It's not going up anymore, but we're finding it really hard to bring it back down. So hopefully that, but to answer the question, how is it traded off? We've managed to already lose that, in Wales anyway, if that is representative of the UK. And of course we know Wales utterly is different to the rest of the UK, of course. Offa's Dyke, which is there, it's like, I'm sure it's going to be very different.